"Don't call this a wedding," Claire Whitmore whispered to herself as the cathedral doors began to open. "Call it the day someone decided my silence was worth more than the truth." The words never left her lips, but they echoed louder than the organ filling St. Augustine Grand Church. Everyone had come expecting another picture-perfect celebration from one of Boston's most admired millionaire couples. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead. Sunlight poured through towering stained-glass windows, painting the marble floor with colors that looked almost heavenly. Guests smiled, cameras waited, and reporters adjusted their microphones outside the entrance. From a distance, it looked like a fairy tale wrapped in luxury. It was not. Hidden inside Claire's small ivory handbag rested a sealed envelope she had promised herself never to open unless everything fell apart. She had carried it for almost 3 years without telling a single soul it existed. Not even her husband, Nathan Caldwell, knew the envelope had survived. And if the person who mailed it years ago was still alive, then today would change far more than a marriage. Claire rested both hands gently over her 8-month pregnant belly as the baby shifted softly beneath the elegant fabric of her dress. That tiny movement reminded her that she was no longer walking into this church alone. She was walking and carrying the only future that still believed in her. Across the sanctuary, Nathan stood near the altar wearing a custom navy tuxedo that looked as flawless as the public image he had spent years creating. Successful entrepreneur, philanthropist, magazine cover businessman. The man who donated millions to children's charities. The man who smiled perfectly whenever a camera appeared. Looking at him now, no stranger would have imagined the distance that had quietly grown between them long before today's ceremony. Nathan's expression remained calm, almost rehearsed, but Claire noticed something others missed. Every few seconds his eyes drifted toward the massive entrance instead of toward his wife. He was waiting for someone, or perhaps making certain someone did not arrive. That single detail settled heavily inside her chest. It was not fear anymore. It was certainty. Somewhere outside those cathedral walls, another story was moving toward them. The choir began singing. Guests rose together. Elegant shoes brushed softly against polished stone as whispers faded into respectful silence. Claire took her first step forward, then another. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the music surrounding her. She remembered the promise Nathan had once made beneath another church ceiling years earlier. He had told her that love meant choosing each other every single day. Somewhere along the way, that promise had quietly disappeared without either of them admitting it aloud. Halfway down the aisle, Claire noticed an elderly woman standing near the last row. She wore a charcoal coat despite the warm spring afternoon and held nothing except a weathered leather folder pressed tightly against her chest. Their eyes met for only a second. Claire did not recognize her. Yet something about the woman's calm expression felt strangely familiar, almost like a forgotten memory refusing to stay buried. Before Claire could look again, the woman disappeared behind a column as though she had never been there at all. Nathan glanced toward the same corner, and for the first time that morning, the confidence vanished from his face. It lasted less than a heartbeat before his practiced smile returned, but Claire had already seen enough. Whatever secret had followed them into St. Augustine Grand Church was no longer waiting outside. It had just walked through the front doors. Claire kept walking even after the choir faded into the background, because stopping now would mean answering questions she was not ready to face. Every polished marble tile beneath her shoes carried another memory from a life that had once looked effortless from the outside. People admired the Caldwell marriage. Business magazines called Nathan and Claire the perfect example of modern success built on trust, ambition, and family values. Friends envied their waterfront home overlooking Boston Harbor, their charity galas, and their carefully photographed holidays in Nantucket. Nobody ever saw the quiet evenings when silence became the loudest person in the room. It had not always been that way. 5 years earlier, Nathan had laughed easily, made pancakes every Sunday morning, and insisted on driving Claire to work even when his own office waited across the city. He remembered anniversaries without reminders. He left handwritten notes beside her coffee mug. He once told her that success meant nothing unless someone waited for him at home. Claire believed every word because he sounded like a man who believed them too. The changes came slowly enough to hide inside ordinary life. More meetings, more late flights, more dinners that became business obligations instead of shared conversations. Nathan rarely raised his voice. He simply became unavailable in ways that could never be measured. Every apology sounded reasonable. Every explanation felt logical. Every promise to make more time arrived just in time to postpone another difficult conversation. Claire kept convincing herself that temporary distance was the price of extraordinary success. Then she discovered she was expecting their first child. For a brief moment, everything seemed to change again. Nathan smiled the way he had years before. He decorated the nursery himself and spent hours comparing baby furniture, reading parenting books, and discussing names for their daughter. Claire believed the difficult season had finally ended. Yet almost as quickly as hope returned, another invisible wall appeared between them. Nathan became strangely protective of his schedule. His phone never left his hand. Conversations stopped whenever Claire entered a room. Even during family dinners, his attention drifted somewhere beyond the dining table, as though another life demanded more of him than the one sitting across from him. Claire never searched his phone. She never hired investigators. She never wanted to become someone who measured love by suspicion. Instead, she listened to smaller things. The hesitation before he answered simple questions. The unfamiliar perfume lingering inside the luxury sedan after another supposed client meeting. The growing habit of locking his office door whenever he worked from home. None of those moments proved anything by themselves. Yet together they formed a quiet pattern that refused to disappear. One rainy evening nearly 8 months earlier, Claire had wandered into the library searching for an old family photo album. Instead, she found a sealed envelope hidden inside the pages of a forgotten legal journal. Her name was written across the front in careful handwriting she did not recognize. There was no return address. Only one sentence had been printed beneath her name. Open this only when you finally realize that appearances can become prisons. Claire had slipped the envelope into her handbag without opening it. Something inside told her the truth carried by those pages would demand a price she was not ready to pay. Standing beneath the towering stained glass windows now, with her unborn daughter quietly moving beneath her heart and the mysterious woman somewhere inside the church, Claire realized that price had finally arrived, and whatever waited inside that forgotten envelope was no longer part of her past. It was about to decide her future. The organ music faded into the background as Claire lowered her eyes for a single moment, pretending to straighten the sleeve of her maternity dress while her thoughts drifted back to the morning that changed everything. It had happened almost 3 months earlier on an unusually quiet Tuesday. Nathan had left before sunrise, claiming an emergency board meeting in New York. He kissed her forehead, wished her luck at her prenatal appointment, and promised he would be home before dinner. Nothing about his voice sounded unusual. Nothing about his smile suggested he was carrying secrets heavier than his briefcase. Claire believed him because trust had become a habit she no longer questioned. That afternoon, she returned from her doctor's appointment carrying ultrasound photographs carefully tucked inside a white envelope. Their daughter was healthy, her heartbeat steady, and the doctor had smiled warmly while explaining that everything looked exactly as it should. Claire had imagined surprising Nathan with the newest images over candlelight, hoping the little girl's tiny profile might remind him that families still mattered more than quarterly profits. She arrived home earlier than expected and noticed something strange before she even unlocked the front door. Nathan's luxury sedan was already parked in the driveway. According to his calendar, he should have been hundreds of miles away. The house itself felt unusually quiet. No television, no music, only the distant ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the foyer. She stepped inside and called his name. No answer came. Instead, she heard the faint sound of voices somewhere above her. They stopped the instant she reached the staircase. A minute later, Nathan appeared at the top landing wearing a perfectly pressed dress shirt, although his tie was missing and the sleeves had been rolled neatly to his elbows. He smiled too quickly. He explained that the New York meeting had been canceled at the last minute and that he had been on a confidential video conference with overseas investors. The explanation sounded reasonable, yet Claire noticed another coffee cup sitting on the hallway table beside the office door. Nathan never drank coffee in the afternoon. Neither of them mentioned it. Later that evening, while clearing the dishwasher, she discovered 2 wine glasses resting inside, both recently washed by hand. Nathan casually insisted that one of his legal consultants had stopped by unexpectedly. Claire nodded, accepted the explanation, and carried the uneasy feeling into bed beside him. Days turned into weeks. and the small inconsistencies multiplied. Important calls ended whenever she entered a room. Weekend business trips became more frequent. Nathan hired a new executive assistant named Vanessa Brooks, whose name appeared constantly on his calendar despite his repeated insistence that she was simply efficient and highly organized. Claire never accused him of anything because every unanswered question seemed to build another invisible wall between them. She found herself speaking less and observing more. Then one afternoon, her longtime neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, unknowingly planted the first seed of undeniable doubt. While returning a borrowed casserole dish, the elderly woman mentioned seeing Nathan dining downtown with an elegant blonde woman several evenings earlier. She laughed politely and assumed it must have been a client because they looked so professional together. Claire forced a smile, thanked her for the dish, and closed the front door before the tears she had been holding back could finally appear. Even then, she refused to believe the worst. She chose hope because hope required less courage than confronting the truth. Yet somewhere inside the quiet corners of her heart, another realization had already begun to grow. Whatever secret Nathan was protecting had never started with another woman. It had started much earlier, and somehow the mysterious envelope hidden inside her handbag was connected to all of it in ways she still could not understand. The memory dissolved as quickly as it had appeared, and Claire found herself standing beneath the towering arches once again, while the soft glow of colored glass stretched across the polished floor. The ceremony had not officially begun, yet the atmosphere already felt strangely rehearsed, as though everyone except her had memorized a script she had never been allowed to read. Friends smiled warmly. Business partners exchanged quiet compliments about Nathan's latest charitable foundation. Members of the press waited respectfully outside, hoping for another flawless photograph of Boston's admired power couple. Claire answered every greeting with the same gentle smile she had practiced for months, the kind that concealed exhaustion better than words ever could. The baby shifted gently beneath her heart, and she rested one hand across her stomach, silently reminding herself that calm mattered now more than pride. Across the sanctuary, Nathan stood speaking with the minister and several board members from his company. His posture remained confident, yet Claire noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders every time the massive entrance doors opened. Someone else was expected. Someone important enough to make a man who rarely appeared nervous glance over his shoulder every few moments. That realization settled quietly into Claire's thoughts. It was the same uneasy feeling she had carried since discovering the mysterious envelope hidden inside the old legal journal. She had still never opened it. Somehow the sealed pages had become less frightening than whatever was unfolding in plain sight. A wedding coordinator approached with a reassuring smile and carefully adjusted the train of Claire's elegant ivory gown. "Everything looks beautiful," she whispered. Claire thanked her politely, although the compliment felt strangely distant. Beautiful was the crystal chandelier reflecting hundreds of tiny lights across the ceiling. Beautiful was the string quartet warming the room with gentle classical music. Beautiful was the scent of fresh white lilies surrounding the altar. None of those things could answer the single question that had quietly followed Claire for months. Why did everything perfect suddenly feel carefully arranged? As guests settled into the pews, Claire noticed Vanessa Brooks entering from a side hallway. Nathan's executive assistant wore a tasteful navy dress appropriate for the occasion and carried a leather portfolio pressed against her side instead of a handbag. She offered Nathan a brief nod before taking a seat several rows from the front. Their exchange lasted no more than 2 seconds, but it carried the silent familiarity of people who no longer needed words. Claire watched Nathan discreetly slip a folded note into his jacket pocket immediately afterward. No one else appeared to notice. Claire looked away before either of them realized she had seen it. The organ resumed, filling every corner of the cathedral with rich, powerful chords. The minister stepped toward the altar and welcomed everyone with warm remarks about commitment, trust, and enduring faith. Claire almost smiled at the irony. Some promises were spoken before witnesses. Others were quietly abandoned long before anyone realized they had disappeared. Then, just as the minister invited everyone to rise, a cool breeze drifted through the open entrance despite the calm spring afternoon outside. Several guests instinctively turned toward the doorway. Claire followed their gaze. The elderly woman she had glimpsed earlier now stood clearly beneath the cathedral entrance, still wearing the charcoal coat and still holding the worn leather folder against her chest. This time she did not hesitate. She slowly removed a pair of reading glasses, looked directly toward Claire with unmistakable recognition, and gave the smallest reassuring nod. Nathan saw her in the same instant. The color drained subtly from his face before he forced another practiced smile for the waiting congregation. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken, not from fear, but from certainty. Whoever that woman truly was, she had not arrived to witness a ceremony. She had arrived carrying answers that someone inside this magnificent church had spent years trying to keep hidden. The cathedral fell into an uneasy silence that no hymn could soften. The minister had barely finished welcoming the congregation when the elderly woman took her first measured step down the center aisle. She did not rush. She did not look around for approval. Every movement carried the quiet confidence of someone who had waited years for exactly this moment. Her charcoal coat contrasted with the bright spring sunlight pouring through the stained glass, making her seem almost untouched by the celebration unfolding around her. Guests exchanged puzzled glances, assuming she must be a late family member or an honored guest delayed by traffic. Claire watched her with growing curiosity, while Nathan's expression remained frozen beneath the practiced smile he had perfected during countless public appearances. Only his tightly clasped hands betrayed that something had shifted beneath the polished surface. The woman stopped halfway down the aisle and looked directly at Claire. There was kindness in her eyes, but there was also unmistakable determination. It was the look of someone who had already made peace with whatever consequences might follow. Without saying a word, she gently raised the weathered leather folder resting against her side. Claire felt an unexpected wave of emotion she could not explain. She had never met this woman, yet every instinct told her she had been carrying answers for a very long time. Nathan stepped away from the altar before anyone else seemed to notice. His voice remained calm enough that only those nearest could hear him. He politely asked whether the woman needed assistance finding a seat. His words sounded courteous, but the question arrived too quickly, almost as though he hoped to redirect her before she spoke. The woman smiled faintly. It was not the smile of someone impressed by wealth or authority. It was the smile of someone recognizing a performance that had already reached its final act. She answered softly that she knew exactly where she belonged. The brief exchange puzzled everyone except Claire. Even Vanessa Brooks lowered the leather portfolio resting on her lap and fixed her attention on the unexpected visitor. Several members of Nathan's executive board exchanged uncertain whispers. One photographer quietly lifted his camera, sensing that something far more significant than another elegant ceremony was beginning to unfold. Claire instinctively placed her hand over her handbag, feeling the sealed envelope still hidden inside. Suddenly, the two mysteries no longer felt separate. The unopened envelope in her possession and the worn folder carried by the stranger seemed connected by invisible threads stretching far into the past. The realization sent a quiet chill through her thoughts. The elderly woman resumed walking until only a few feet separated her from Claire. She studied Claire's face with unmistakable tenderness before speaking words so quietly that only Claire could hear them. "You have your father's eyes." Claire's breath caught instantly. Her father had passed away when she was still a teenager, and very few people outside her family had ever known him well enough to make such a comparison. Before Claire could respond, the woman added another sentence that seemed to stop time itself. "Your father trusted me to deliver the truth when you were finally ready to hear it." Nathan immediately interrupted with another carefully measured smile, suggesting that perhaps everyone should continue with the ceremony before discussing personal matters. His tone remained composed, yet a faint tremor had entered his voice for the first time all morning. Claire looked from Nathan to the mysterious woman and then toward the unopened envelope resting inside her handbag. She suddenly understood why she had never been able to throw it away. Some promises waited patiently until the right day arrived. Around them, the choir remained silent, the guests sat motionless, and even the spring breeze drifting through the open cathedral doors seemed to pause. In that extraordinary stillness, Claire realized the celebration everyone expected had quietly disappeared. What stood before her now was something entirely different, and every answer she had been searching for was finally within reach. Claire stared at the woman as though every unanswered question from the past had suddenly taken human form. The cathedral remained completely silent. Even the minister stepped back without interrupting, sensing that whatever was unfolding no longer belonged to ceremony, but to truth. The elderly woman took one final step forward before carefully placing the weathered leather folder upon the polished wooden rail beside the front pew. She finally introduced herself. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore. Years ago, I made a promise to a man who believed that one day his daughter would need someone brave enough to finish the story he could not." Claire felt the words settle heavily inside her heart. Her father's name had rarely been spoken since his passing, yet hearing someone describe him with such quiet respect awakened memories she had almost forgotten. Nathan remained composed on the surface, but Claire noticed his jaw tighten ever so slightly. It was the expression of a man calculating possibilities instead of listening. Eleanor slowly opened the leather folder. Inside were neatly organized letters, legal documents, photographs, and a small velvet box that had clearly aged with time. She removed the first letter and held it carefully without unfolding it. "This letter was written by your father 2 weeks before his final business trip," she said gently. "He believed there were financial decisions inside his company that deserved closer attention, and he feared that if anything unexpected happened, someone might one day need the truth." Claire's heartbeat quickened. She looked instinctively toward Nathan, whose expression remained calm despite the growing attention from every guest inside the cathedral. Eleanor continued speaking with remarkable patience. "Your father asked me never to interfere unless 2 conditions became true. First, that you were old enough to make your own decisions. Second, that someone attempted to build a future by hiding the past. The second condition has arrived today." Quiet whispers spread through the congregation. Several members of Nathan's executive board exchanged uneasy glances, while Vanessa Brooks lowered her eyes toward the marble floor without speaking. Nathan finally stepped forward with a reassuring smile that seemed directed more toward the audience than toward Eleanor herself. He thanked her politely for preserving family memories and suggested they continue the discussion privately after the ceremony. Eleanor answered with surprising kindness. "Privacy protects mistakes when they remain small. Truth belongs in the light once those mistakes begin shaping other people's lives." Her calm response carried no anger, only certainty. Claire reached into her handbag almost without thinking and removed the sealed envelope she had carried for years. Eleanor recognized it immediately. "You never opened it," she observed softly. Claire slowly shook her head. "I was afraid everything inside would change my life forever." Eleanor smiled with genuine compassion. Sometimes unopened truth changes our lives even more than truth itself. She gently invited Claire to place the envelope beside the documents inside the folder. The handwriting on both matched perfectly. The realization left Claire speechless. They had been written by the same person years apart, waiting patiently to be reunited on this exact day. Nathan's confident posture finally began to fade. His eyes remained fixed on the folder, as though he already knew what rested inside the remaining pages. Claire noticed something else as well. Nathan was no longer watching Eleanor. He was watching the cathedral entrance, almost expecting another unexpected arrival. Before Claire could ask why, the massive wooden doors opened once again. A cool breeze swept through the sanctuary as a uniformed courier carrying a sealed archival case quietly entered the church. He approached Eleanor with respectful formality and handed her the case after confirming her identity. She thanked him, placed the case beside the folder, and looked directly at Claire. "Your father believed that evidence should never rely on memory alone," she said calmly. "Everything needed to understand what really happened has finally arrived." Across the cathedral, every conversation disappeared. Nathan closed his eyes for only a brief second before opening them again. And in that silent moment, Claire realized the carefully polished image he had spent years protecting had begun to crack under the weight of a truth that had waited far longer than either of them had imagined. The courier quietly stepped back after delivering the archival case, leaving every pair of eyes inside the cathedral fixed on Eleanor. No one reached for a phone. No one whispered anymore. Even the photographers who had arrived hoping to capture elegant wedding portraits sensed they were witnessing something entirely different. Eleanor rested one hand on the weathered leather folder and the other on the newly delivered case before looking directly at Claire. "There is one final promise your father asked me to keep," she said with remarkable calm. "He believed that truth should never arrive in pieces because pieces can be ignored. It must arrive complete so that no one can rearrange it afterward." Claire felt her heartbeat steady instead of racing. For the first time in months, she no longer feared what was coming. Uncertainty had been far heavier than truth. Nathan took a slow breath and stepped forward with the confidence that had carried him through countless shareholder meetings and public interviews. He thanked everyone for their patience and suggested postponing the discussion until after the ceremony, reminding the guests that family matters deserved privacy and respect. His voice remained measured, almost reassuring, and for a brief moment several guests appeared relieved by the familiar authority in his tone. Then Eleanor gently opened the archival case. Inside rested several sealed evidence envelopes, a digital storage drive, notarized correspondence, and an old leather notebook whose pages had yellowed with age. She did not dramatize the contents. She simply placed each item carefully on the polished wooden table beside the minister. The deliberate silence surrounding every movement became more powerful than any accusation. One of Nathan's senior board members slowly stood from the front pew. He recognized the notebook immediately. That was the project journal maintained by Claire's father during the earliest years of the investment company. Nathan's eyes shifted toward the notebook for only an instant before returning to Eleanor. Claire noticed that tiny movement. It told her more than words ever could. Eleanor nodded respectfully toward the board member before addressing the room. Years ago, your founder believed complete transparency would protect both his family and the people who trusted his business. He documented every major decision by hand. Copies of financial records, signed letters, and independent legal reviews were preserved separately in case the originals ever disappeared. She paused only long enough to let the meaning settle over the congregation. This archive was never intended to destroy anyone. It was intended to prevent the truth from being lost. Claire carefully unfolded the sealed envelope she had carried for years. Inside rested a handwritten letter from her father together with a small brass key taped neatly to the final page. Her eyes filled with tears as she recognized his unmistakable handwriting. My dearest Claire, if you are reading this, someone has finally placed honesty above comfort. Trust the woman who brings these pages because I trusted her with everything. I could no longer protect myself. Do not choose anger. Choose clarity. The room remained perfectly still while Claire silently finished reading. She closed the letter and gently held the brass key in her palm. Eleanor smiled softly. That key opens the final deposit box your father established before his last journey. Everything inside has remained untouched until today. Nathan looked toward the cathedral entrance once more, but this time no rescue arrived, no interruption appeared, and no convenient explanation presented itself. The confidence that had defined him throughout the morning quietly faded beneath the weight of undeniable history. Claire lifted her eyes from the letter and looked directly at him. She did not speak with bitterness or triumph. She simply searched his face for the answer that had escaped her for years. In that silent exchange, she realized something unexpected. The greatest secret inside the cathedral was no longer hidden inside Eleanor's folder, the archival case, or her father's letter. It was written across Nathan's expression, and everyone present had finally begun to read it for themselves. No one moved after Claire folded her father's letter and carefully slipped the brass key into her palm. The silence inside the cathedral no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to realization. Nathan looked across the congregation as though searching for a familiar face willing to interrupt the moment, but every expression reflected the same quiet expectation. The minister remained beside the altar without speaking. The board members who had admired Nathan for years now studied the documents resting on the wooden table instead of the man they had followed. Eleanor gently closed the archival case before looking toward Claire with calm encouragement. This has never been about winning, she said softly. It has always been about allowing the truth to stand where it can finally be seen. Claire nodded. She suddenly understood why her father had written those words years before. Truth did not need anger to become powerful. It only needed patience. Nathan finally stepped closer, his voice controlled but noticeably quieter than before. He insisted that business records taken out of historical context could easily create misunderstandings. He reminded everyone that companies changed over time, leadership evolved, and difficult decisions often appeared unfair when viewed without complete information. His explanation sounded polished, the kind of statement investors had trusted for years. Yet before anyone responded, One of the senior directors slowly opened the leather notebook and compared several handwritten entries with the notarized correspondence inside the archival case. His expression changed almost immediately. The signatures matched. The dates matched. Even the reference numbers corresponded with archived corporate filings remembered by several longtime executives. No dramatic accusation followed. Instead, one director after another quietly examined the materials for themselves. The absence of argument became more convincing than any speech. Vanessa Brooks remained seated near the front, her leather portfolio untouched on her lap. After several long moments, she stood, walked toward Eleanor, and respectfully placed the portfolio beside the archival case. "I believe these belong with the rest of the record," she said calmly. Nathan looked at her with visible surprise, but Vanessa lowered her eyes before continuing. "I accepted this position believing I was protecting confidential business matters. Over time, I realized some documents deserved independent review instead of permanent silence." Claire watched the exchange without satisfaction or resentment. She simply felt an unexpected sense of peace settling where confusion had lived for so long. Eleanor opened the portfolio and discovered carefully organized correspondence, meeting schedules, financial memoranda, and written recommendations that completed the timeline established by Claire's father's records. Nothing inside the folder relied on rumor. Every page supported another page. Every date confirmed another date. The entire story fit together with quiet precision. One of the legal advisors attending as a guest stepped forward after reviewing several documents. He spoke respectfully, explaining that the material appeared significant enough to require independent examination through the proper legal process. Eleanor thanked him and closed the folder once more. "That is exactly why these records were preserved," she replied. "Not to encourage public judgment, but to ensure responsible review by the people entrusted to examine facts." Claire looked toward Nathan. For the first time since entering the cathedral, she saw exhaustion replacing confidence. The carefully maintained image that had once seemed impossible to question now rested entirely upon explanations that no longer carried the same certainty. Outside, the distant sound of news cameras gathering beyond the cathedral steps drifted faintly through the open doors. Word had already begun spreading that the ceremony had unexpectedly stopped. Claire reached for Nathan's hand one final time. She did not hold it to restore what had been lost. She held it briefly to acknowledge that their journey together had reached its natural ending. Then she gently let go. As sunlight poured through the stained glass once more, Eleanor placed her hand upon Claire's shoulder and quietly whispered that the hardest part was finally behind her. Claire looked toward the cathedral entrance, where a future she had never expected now waited beyond the open doors, and for the first time in many months, she walked forward without carrying the weight of unanswered questions. 6 months later, the first light of autumn filtered through the wide windows of a quiet lakeside home several hours outside Boston. The morning air carried the scent of pine trees and fresh coffee instead of camera flashes and whispered speculation. Claire stood on the wooden porch, gently rocking her infant daughter in her arms while golden leaves drifted across the calm water beyond the garden. For the first time in years, silence no longer felt lonely. It felt peaceful. The difficult months following the interrupted ceremony had unfolded exactly as Eleanor had promised. Independent investigators reviewed every document preserved inside the archival case, the leather folder, and the deposit box opened with the small brass key left by Claire's father. The process moved carefully, respectfully, and according to the law. Business records were examined. Corporate governance was reviewed. Several decisions made years earlier received renewed legal attention, and leadership changes quietly followed. Newspapers reported the developments for weeks, but Claire rarely read the headlines. She had learned that healing did not begin with public opinion. It began with finally accepting the truth without allowing it to define the rest of her life. Nathan disappeared almost entirely from public view. He resigned from every executive position connected to the company, while legal and financial matters continued through the proper channels. Reporters searched constantly for statements, dramatic interviews, and emotional confrontations, but Claire offered none. She understood that dignity often spoke more clearly than revenge. One afternoon, Eleanor joined her on the porch, carrying 2 warm mugs of tea. She smiled as the baby reached toward the falling leaves dancing in the gentle breeze. "Your father would have loved this little girl," Eleanor said quietly. Claire looked down at her daughter, whose bright blue eyes reflected the same quiet curiosity that had once filled old family photographs. I spent so many years searching for answers, Claire replied softly. I never realized the answers were leading me here instead of back there. Eleanor nodded with understanding. Sometimes the greatest inheritance parents leave their children is not money or property. It is the courage to choose integrity when easier paths appear. Inside the restored family home, the old leather notebook rested beside Claire's father's framed photograph. The weathered pages no longer represented unfinished business. They had become part of a family history finally understood instead of quietly feared. Nearby, the sealed envelope that Claire had carried for years remained carefully preserved inside a memory box. She decided never to hide it again. One day her daughter would be old enough to ask questions about the past. And when that day arrived, Claire wanted every answer to begin with honesty instead of silence. As the weeks became months, Claire established a charitable foundation dedicated to helping families facing financial hardship after unexpected legal disputes. She named it the Whitmore Promise because promises, she had learned, could survive far longer than lies. Volunteers, attorneys, counselors, and community leaders joined the project, not because they admired a dramatic story, but because they believed ordinary people deserved access to fairness before fear. On the first anniversary of the day, everything changed. Claire returned to the cathedral with Eleanor and her daughter. The stained glass windows still scattered brilliant colors across the marble floor exactly as they had before, yet the building felt entirely different. There were no reporters waiting outside, no executives, no ceremony, only quiet gratitude. Claire placed a single white lily beneath the memorial plaque honoring her father and whispered the words she had wished she could have spoken years earlier. Thank you for believing that truth would find me when I was finally ready to carry it. As she walked back toward the open doors holding her daughter's tiny hand, warm sunlight filled the sanctuary behind her. She did not look back again because the past had already given her its final gift. Some fortunes are measured in numbers, some victories are celebrated with applause, but the rarest kind of success belongs to those who leave a place carrying neither bitterness nor fear, only the quiet certainty that dignity, once reclaimed, never needs to be defended again.